Ladies and gentlemen, the session will begin shortly. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We will now begin our first plenary session on the state of the global economy and its implication for emerging market economies. Please welcome on stage the chair of the session, Karim Aynaoui, Executive President of the Policy Center for the New South. And now, please join me in welcoming on stage Mustapha Nabli, CEO at North Africa Bureau of Economic Studies. Nialé Kaba, Minister of Planning and Development of Cote d'Ivoire. Roberto de Oliveira Campos Neto, Governor of the Central Bank of Brazil. Jean-Daniel Gerber, Chairman of the Board at Swiss Investment Fund in Emerging Markets. Roberto de Ocampo, Chairman and CEO at Philippine Veterans Bank. Erik Berglof, Chief Economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Indermit Gill, Chief Economist and Senior Vice President for Development Economics at the World Bank Group. And Haruhiko Kuroda, former Governor of the Bank of Japan, will be joining us online. Karim Aynaoui, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. What a panel. Do you realize? Thank you for being here. And We have a great topic, you know, what's going on basically in the global economy and what it means for us being the emerging markets, us being the New South, us being the Global South. You have registered this, huh? All of us, this is the same kind of words. I'm going to be very brief, and then we'll start with the former governor. Welcome, Governor, online. It's a great pleasure to have you. But in a nutshell, and it was said in the introductory remarks, the world is in disorder. Everything is interconnected. As economists, we used to congregate among ourselves without even mentioning international politics. It was a given that the world was stable, that trade was flourishing, that we all agreed on the forms of globalization, that we have some sort of point on the horizon that we were all converging toward. This world has changed, and of course politics is affecting the economy, and it's posing challenges to policymakers, and we have here a fantastic panel of former and current policymakers that can share their appreciation, their views, the challenges they face, as lessons also for other countries. And this world, of course, is affecting us here in Africa. At some point we were told, and I'll stop here, and it can be a long list of challenges, but we thought that, you know, with quantitative easing, that money will always be there with excess liquidity. You know, we were swimming in liquidity, and we said, take some debt, there's no problem, interest rate will stay there. And suddenly we wake up, there's inflation. Like suddenly we woke up, there's a war here in various corners of the world. So there's an interesting parallel to be made between the volatility of economic condition and macroeconomic that leads to complex macroeconomic policies, and as well volatility in the political world that leads to very complex games and intensity of interactions that are needed by policymakers to solve that. So policymakers are intensely solicited. It's more complex, more difficult, more volatile. It's exposed to the public opinion, to an amplifying effect of social networks. So policy making is under scrutiny. It's tougher, difficult. So please do share some of your ideas, thoughts, suggestions on those topics. So let me start with the Governor Kuroda from London, and we really regret that you're not with us here today. So please do share your views on the fragmentation of the global economy and what it means for us in emerging market economies. You have 6 to 8 minutes. As soon as you see me being agitated on my chair, you'll see it means that it's 6 minutes. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay. Since I'm in London, participating in an international conference here, I could not come to Marrakesh, but through the high-tech Zoom, I can talk to you and respond to any questions later. First, I would like to speak about fragmentation in global economies. And then I would like to point out a few challenges, particularly faced by emerging economies in coming years and decades. Now, fragmentation in global economies has become crystal clear, particularly after the Ukraine war started February last year. But even before that, as you may know, Russia invaded Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova middle of 2010s. And also China strengthened military actions in South China Sea since early 2010s. but clearly, after the Ukraine war, fragmentation in global economies has become quite clear, reflected among G20. As you know, G20, if combined the G20 GDPs, it would be about 85% of the world GDP. So G20 countries reflect the global economies. Now, I do think that among G20, now there are three groups. Group A consists of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Group B consists of G7 plus Australia. And Group C consists of so-called Global South. As you can imagine, since the war in Ukraine, G7 countries imposed very strict economic and financial sanctions on Russia and asked Russia to stop the war immediately. But of course, during the G20 meeting, Russia refused to do so. And also G7 countries asked China to make significant effort to reduce debt for Sri Lanka or Zambia, but so far China has been very reluctant to do so. And during the meetings, some countries asked Saudi Arabia to increase oil production because last year oil prices went up sharply. But of course, as the practical head of OPEC, Saudi Arabia refused to do so. So Group A countries and Group B countries are completely against with each other. And already G7 countries completely stopped trading and investment relationship with Russia. And Russia, of course, now export oil and gas to China and global south countries, including India. So the global economies are now clearly fragmented. On the other hand, global south emerging economies, they maintain some sort of neutrality, continuing strong economic relationship with Group A countries as well as Group B countries. But I must say that Russia is completely excluded from the G7 countries. And since the world has committed to make carbon half by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050, Russian economy would become quite stagnant because more than half of its exports consist of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, on the other hand, China is completely different from Russia. For G20 countries, the largest trading partner, export market as well as import sources, China is most outstanding for G20 countries. For instance, for Russia and Saudi Arabia, China is already largest export market and the largest import source. And for the United States, the largest export market is Canada, but already largest import source is China. For Japan, import-wise, China. Germany, UK, largest export market, the US, but the largest source of import are already China. France and Italy, they are more concentrated on intra-regional trade, so that for export as well as import, Germany is the largest. And then Canada, of course, because of the free trade agreement, export as well as import, largest trading partner in the United States. And now, for Australia, like Japan, China is the largest export market and the largest source of import. If you look at global South countries, Mexico, maybe because of the free trade agreement with the United States, export, import, US. But for Argentina, because of free trade agreement, certainly Brazil is still the largest export market, but already for Argentina, largest import source is China. And amazingly for Brazil, South Korea, Indonesia, India, as well as for South Africa, the largest trading partner, export as well as import-wise, already China. So as far as GDP is concerned, China is the second largest economy next to the United States. But as far as trade is concerned, China is already by far the largest traders in the world. And so as Secretary Janet Yellen recently told, even for the United States, decoupling with China is impossible. Maybe some de-risking with China may be necessary, but decoupling is impossible. So fragmentation in global economies continue. That would totally damage the trade between Russia and the G7 countries. But with China, it's impossible, and China continues to be a dominant trading partner for almost all countries in G20 members. So this is a fragmentation in global economy, and since this fragmentation is caused not by economic factors, but by military or security factors, I don't know how this fragmentation could be ameliorated and so on. So, but probably for the time being, maybe 5 or 10 years, this kind of fragmentation will continue. Now, under this situation,
can you conclude?
I talk a little bit about 4 largest economies: the US, China, Japan, Germany. And IMF recently issued World Economic Outlook, and for US and Japan, they raised growth forecast, while for Germany and China, they reduced the growth forecast.
Yes.
And so the situation is a bit complicated. Now, I would like to mention 2 things just for emerging economies. One is the climate change. And as I said, the world has committed to reduce CO2 emissions. And interestingly, US is by far the largest per capita CO2 emissions. And Germany, Japan, China, almost an equal amount of CO2 emissions, about half of the US level. And finally, the water resources. US has abundant water resources. Japan may have sufficient water resources, but Germany and China have somewhat smaller water resources. And also, as you know, South Asian countries like India, Pakistan, they are already in the situation of water shortage. So these challenges faced by major economies as well as emerging economies could be quite important, vital, and world economy, including the emerging economies, must squarely respond to these challenges.
Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you very much. Structural dynamics, complex, trends, contagion, complex balancing act for policymakers, and of course, what's happening in China is, of course, affecting particularly Germany and Latin America. Indermit, Gill, you're the chief economist of the World Bank. You just issued your traditional global economic outlook. Could you please share with us, as you prefer, could you share with us the major highlights, and in particular focusing on maybe growth and the structural components of what you see sort of there to stay with us? The floor is yours for 6-8 minutes. Thank you.
Very, very much. So I'm going to first speak as the chief economist, and then I'm going to talk. Then I'm going to speak as Indermit Gill. Right?
So you tell us when you shift.
Yes, I'm going to shift.
But only 6 minutes.
But only 6 minutes.
We'll understand, I'm sure.
Yes,
thank
sir.
you.
So I want to thank Harinder very much. First, I want to thank him for inviting me to speak over here. So first, I'm going to give you the party line, and then I'll give you the Indermit Gill line, right? So in terms of the party line, like, we just did our global economic update, and we were somewhat more pessimistic than the IMF. Yeah? But the three main takeaways, I think that we need to...
The team, can you please mute me, Governor Kuroda, please? The team?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm doing it now.
Adreri.
Thank you very much.
Could you please mute?
So please, can I reclaim my 1 minute?
Don't worry, we are fair in the New South, as you know.
Okay.
You
Yes.
can go ahead.
Yes. So we have these sort of three takeaways, right? And the three takeaways is that the global economy has shown a lot of strength so far, but is slowing down. So we expected more countries to actually have problems because there were so many adverse shocks all at once. But essentially, we have been pleasantly surprised, and that we have not seen any large economy actually going through a lot of trouble. The trouble, though, is that now global growth is slowing down and is going to remain below historical averages, right? The other good thing that has happened is that inflation has declined, but the problem there too is that it's still above central bank targets, and is likely to stay above that, which means that we should expect high interest rates for longer. And even this subdued outlook can actually be made much worse by tighter financial conditions because of this persisting inflation, financial sector stress. Then the third big weakness is actually weaker than expected activity in China, disruptions in commodity markets, climate-related natural disasters, softening global trade growth, and economic fragmentation. So all of these bad things are happening at the same time. The thing that we are concerned about, the thing that we've been working a lot about, and we are concerned about a lot, is weakness in investment. So the world, has high debt and low investment rates, broadly speaking, right? And I think that private investment ought to be a big topic of discussion, both at the annual meetings and here, perhaps. Then the third message, of course, is that so we have these weakness in investment and the feeblest of all trade recoveries. So if you look at the trade recovery, we are in the middle of the weakest ever post-recession recovery in global trade, just so you know. Yeah? Okay. And then the third one, of course, is that there are all these difficult trade-offs ahead for governments, and these include how to calibrate monetary and fiscal policy to try to lower inflation while also trying to promote growth, combining temporary interventions with structural measures to boost investment and employment, and balancing national security as well as geo-economic fragmentation concerns, and then addressing global problems like climate change and debt distress while dealing with domestic economic and social pressures. Right? So these are what we say formally. So now I'm going to speak as Indermit Gill now. So I'll tell you about three things. The first one is risks. So when I took over this job, we would do these updates, and we would have a risk slide. The risk slide back in the beginning of 2021, for example, had 3 or 4 risks, right? Pandemics, it had something, it would have 3 or 4 risks. With each passing presentation, we've been adding risks. So if you look at the latest slide that we have, and I can share those slides with you, we now have 9 risks, right? 9 risks mean that one of these risks is bound to materialize, right? And last week, one of them did. You have conflict now in the Middle East as well. So we had that risk. Now, so suddenly what we call, so all of our forecasts, by the way, all of our forecasts, short-term, long-term forecasts and so on, they're all based on these risks not materializing. Now that's fine when you're talking about 1 or 2 or 3 risks. When you're talking about 9 risks, it's a bad assumption to say that one of these risks is not going to materialize, right? So it makes it very hard to actually forecast thing, but you have to start to sort of say, okay, here's my baseline forecast, which assumes that some of these risks will materialize, right? So the risk that has materialized is greater conflict, right? And because of that, even the forecast that we made just a couple of weeks ago, which was essentially 2.4% global growth, would seem actually rosy by now, right? And 2.5% growth for next year, global growth, is perhaps even more rosy, especially if the conflict spreads. The second thought I had was the problem of debt distress. And you've been hearing a lot about it, but you've been mainly hearing about it because of the countries, the low-income countries that are eligible for the G20 Common Framework, and the problems that we are facing in trying to sort of get any kind of debt relief to them. So the Common Framework so far has basically yielded debt relief of essentially $0, right? Okay. So we've been struggling with that. Now, this was something that we knew was a problem when Zambia declared bankruptcy, for example, and so on. But since that time, we know that actually middle-income countries, those countries that are not eligible for the G20 Common Framework, they have also got into trouble, right? But these are all countries, by the way, they're in trouble because they have high levels of external debt, right? So these countries obviously now have a major debt overhang on them until this is resolved quickly, and there doesn't seem like any chance that these things will get resolved quickly. Even if Zambia does go through, China has made it clear that Zambia is not setting any precedent, right? So we can't use that precedent to speed up the next treatment and the next treatment and so on. So then the question is, for these countries that are now in external debt distress, we don't yet have a mechanism that can actually resolve this quickly, right? And unless one does that, you're not going to actually return these countries to growth. But as I was looking at the regional updates from East Asia, from South Asia, and so on, I found that I started to worry a lot more, because I started to look at countries, not just those who had borrowed a lot externally, but countries that had borrowed a lot domestically. So when you start to look at that, you actually find that South Asia actually has the highest public debt to GDP ratio of about 86% on average, okay? And if you look then at investment ratios for these countries, you actually sort of see private investment ratios, they are declining a lot. And it's because these governments have been borrowing internally, right? And the smaller firms, at least in these places, cannot get finance because they're being crowded out, okay? So you have the debt overhang problem when you have high external debt. You have this domestic crowding out problem when you have high domestic debt. And by the way, debt ratios have been going up not just in South Asia, but also East Asia. And we worry about this the most because these are the two parts of the world which are actually growing at more than 5% a year and so on. So we are now worried about that. My third point has to do with China, right? So, back to my second point. Now, if you look at countries that have high external debt distress, and then add to them the countries that also have high domestic debt, you now have a few countries left. And so you should say, okay, well, we'll be very hopeful about those countries. But those countries also face a very stiff challenge. They face if they do end up having high private investment ratios and so on, they don't have this debt overhang, so they have macro stability. They have to produce goods, right? And they have to sell them. But the trade environment is not looking particularly good. You're starting to sort of see now that among the G20 countries and so on, there are a lot of trade restrictions. So if you look, for example, at 2019, there were about 1,000 trade and investment restrictions. If you looked at 2022, it was 3,000. And just by the middle of this year, it was already 1,500. Okay? So basically, you have a trade regime that will actually constrain growth for these countries. So the countries that have high domestic debt are not likely to sort of go into debt distress very quickly. But what they are doing is that they are playing with growth distress, because you will actually, as soon as you start to sort of see that private investment is not picking up or it's going down, you'll start to see these countries slowing down too. My last point, and I'll stop, has to do with China. So as I was reading the press, especially in the United States, I'm finding that there is a lot of wishing ill on China, I would say. Right? And I think this is a terrible thing. I think it's a terrible thing for three reasons. So the first one is, if you care about poverty, I think it's a terrible thing. Because China, if you use the poverty line that is appropriate for a country of about $10,000 per capita, it's about $6.85. About a quarter of China is actually poor by that standard. Okay? So this is not a very generous poverty line, by the way. So that means about 350 million Chinese are poor. That's larger than the population of the United States. To wish ill on China is to wish ill on them. Okay? That's the first one. The second reason why you shouldn't wish ill on China, even if you don't care about the Chinese poor, is that China is a big demander of goods from other countries. So I try to sort of look to sort of see, you have all these stories about China +1, and that +1 would be India and so on. So I try to sort of look at India's imports versus China's imports, right? And basically what you see is that you have to add up India plus Indonesia plus South Africa plus Mexico plus Argentina plus one more country, okay, in order to get to the 2.7 trillion that China imports every year. Okay? That's how much China actually demands from other places. So if you wish ill on China, which means China's economy slows down, so do their imports decline too. And then the third point, which I don't need to labor over here, is you cannot simultaneously say that we're going to speed up climate action and we're going to isolate China from trade, because China is the biggest supplier of green intermediates, batteries, solar, wind turbines, and so on. So you cannot both say that, oh, we don't want to trade with China, and second say speed up climate change. So for all of those reasons, don't wish ill on China.
Thank you very much. Risks, path dependency, slippery slopes, changing equilibrias. It's a complex word, and we can quickly fall in vicious circles, to put it in broad terms. Next, I have Erik, and when you sit, you're now in China, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. So I would invite you to focus a little bit on China, which I think is, of course, as it was said before, an important player, notwithstanding for its impact on demand at the global level, but also in the area of climate change and in its region, of course. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting forum, and the first chance I have to visit this institution, so thank you very much. So China is in focus. Both previous speakers have emphasized the importance of China. I don't have the capacity of Indermit to split my personality into, some party line and myself. But I'm always much more interested in listening to Indermit than to the party line, and so was the case right now. So China is in focus, obviously, because it has been the main driver of growth in recent decades. And we have heard all about how important it is for trade, and both for the global north and for the global south. And of course, I think many of us were disappointed by how long or how slowly the economy of China has come out of COVID. And I think most of us had expected quite a quick bounce back. But for reasons that I will get into, we should probably have been more realistic. The first reason, I think, is that households, and we saw that already if you go back to the first lockdown in China, after that, it took a long time for households, because many of them have very recently become, somewhat welfare, have been able to put aside some money to deal with health and social expenditures and so on. The first thing they did after the first lockdown was to start rebuilding their buffers. And I think that's what we're seeing going on in the Chinese economy at the moment. We also see in the private sector that there has been quite a lot of maybe policy errors and sort of unfortunate arbitrary interventions and so on. So people are really watching and staying on the sidelines in the private sector. Obviously, construction, that dates further back, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but construction is a very important part of the Chinese economy. It's basically underwater. For example, there's essentially no land trade for the moment, so no new land being purchased or sold to build construction. So that sector is weighing down the financial sector, because we know that when banks have a lot of exposure to property sector, or have a lot of bad exposures in general, a lot of energy of management of banks goes into dealing with those. So that's the domestic environment. Then, of course, as we've heard, also this very feeble external environment, particularly when it comes to recovery of trade, which is so central to China, at least to date. And we should emphasize so that China had become less dependent on trade over time. So those are the kind of issues that come immediately out of COVID. If we look at some of them, they are actually more longer term. So obviously the construction sector has to do with the kind of expansion that China did as part of the global response to the global financial crisis. That response also, I think, had a negative impact on productivity, and also the fact that some of the investments have been sort of more security-oriented rather than economics-oriented. All that adds up to falling productivity in much of the economy, and also some social challenge. You've seen some very serious unemployment for younger people and so on. So all that is part of the picture, and something that will affect China going forward. Of course, you would say, why don't you just stimulate? So we already heard some of the policy dilemmas that many policymakers around the world are facing. China is not different. China, it's not so easy to stimulate, and they have also burnt themselves very badly from the stimulus that they did in the global financial crisis. So it's not that easy, and I think China will come out of that sort of short-term funk, but I think, and China will, I think this year, make a meaningful contribution to growth. It won't be exactly what we thought at the beginning of the year, but it will maybe be around 20% or 25 or 30% of global growth, which is not too bad, and the growth target for this year is within reach, even though they might not exactly reach it. So I think the longer term is more worrying, because we have heard about fragmentation. I won't go into that so much, but it's clearly a big issue, not only for China, but for all of Asia, and actually very much for the global south. The global value chains that have become so important part of global trade. If we look at what happened over the last 10 or 15 years, it's really that the global south has come in take a much more prominent role in those, and many more countries. It's not just China. China actually is, of course, a very important part of that, but the rest of the emerging world has increased as much, and so many new countries, and particularly in Asia, have been able to join. So that's something that we are risking with fragmentation. The other part, and Indermit was alluding to this, I think the global value chains is perhaps the most effective tool we have to achieve decarbonization, and that hurting the global value chains, I think, will hurt not only China, but also that whole effort to decarbonize the world. So let me end with just a reflection on this notion of China's long-term role in the world economy. So it's very popular right now. You see it all over. Peak China. You know, everyone appears so surprised that China may not reach United States as fast as people thought, and maybe never will reach United States. Anyone who had been keeping an eye on demographics would have seen this development, you know, much earlier. And of course, that I didn't mention demographics earlier, but of course that's also part of the challenges in the construction sector and so on that we are facing. A very different demographics, and China's population will decrease quite significantly. So that may be bad for the rest of the world, that China will no longer be the same engine in the global economy, and some people may welcome the fact that China will not become as big as it originally was forecasted to be. But I think for the Chinese, this should not be the main concern, because China's economy will continue growing with a smaller population, allowing a lot of people to continue coming out of poverty and also, you know, becoming much wealthier. So I guess I want to end on that note, that we shouldn't wish bad on China. China has a lot to contribute to the global economy, and even if China doesn't catch up with the US, that's not the end of the world. I think that's something that's still plenty of room for Chinese to prosper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik. You are our best performer in terms of timing so far. China, middle income trap, let us see, not easy. More difficult times ahead. We stay in Asia with Mr. De Ocampo. Please, the floor is yours to share with us your thoughts and ideas on the situation in Asia more generally. Thank you.
My dear EMF colleagues, friends, honorable participants, as we come into 2024, we may be looking back at 2023 as a major turning point in history, best summarized by the tectonic shift in geopolitics from a unipolar world towards a multipolar one, perhaps the beginnings of a reversal from a hitherto welcome, though hegemonic-led progression of world governance towards a more broadly based distribution of economic influence and cross-border interaction, occasioned mainly by the rapid rise of economic growth and influence, principally by China, but now also by India, Russia, and much of ASEAN, and the ramifications of the Ukraine war and the COVID pandemic. In short, we've arrived at a crossroads, one towards the hopeful and optimistic path off, as the G20 declaration puts it, one Earth, one family, sharing one future, and the other, an extended confrontation involving East versus West or North versus South. The core sentiment for the former path is best summarized by India's Foreign Minister Jai Shankar's statement before the UN General Assembly. Quote, "The days when few nations set the agenda and expected others to fall in line are over. Diplomacy and dialogue are the only effective solutions." The sentiment for the latter part might be, are they over? The world is feeling its way, as it were, and transitioning between these two paths. There is a widespread appeal towards peace at the same time that war drums continue to beat primarily between nuclear superpowers. During this transition, Asia looms large and once again is viewed in some quarters as, quote, the bright spot in the world economy, unquote. That view is neither new nor unfounded. You may recall that during the mid-90s, several papers were written and published by the World Bank, among others, touting the so-called Asian miracle, as China's growth rose at unprecedented speed, and so did those in many Southeast Asian countries, that led writers to describe them as tiger economies. The common model for achieving tigerhood was Japan's export-driven manufacturing-based economy that took advantage of its ever-improving technical prowess by manufacturing and exporting a wide range of products mainly to the West. Then, the Asian financial crisis struck in July 1997. I happened to be the chairman of the finance ministers of ASEAN at that time, and just about brought the tigerhood momentum to a dead stop. Many lessons were learned by the Asian nations from that sorry episode, but perhaps among the most important ones was that it was unwise to continue to be largely dependent on the West, both for growing and repairing Asian nations' economies. Thus, the push towards establishing an Asian bond, among others. Now, the process of evolving the economic world order from unipolar to multipolar, that lesson assumes greater significance and strategic importance. Clearly, the G20 declarations, wherein the largest Asian economies undertook leading roles, converge on a strategy of disengaging from continuing Western-led perceived hegemony towards a now broadly based and hopefully more peaceful and efficient system of international trade and relationships. The outcome of these meetings, both G20 and BRICS, appears to converge as follows. 1, there is a global emerging market larger than the traditional Western-dominated one, and Asia may be its giant. Western sanctions appear to have instead weakened some Western economies, while leading South nations appear to grow. The time has come for the world to diversify its trade opportunities. 2, balanced growth requires less dependence on the dominant US dollar. This has been apparently triggered by concerns about US penchant to weaponize the dollar via sanctions, as well as the US proclivity to print money and balloon its debt, resulting in correctional moves that have serious effects on others. In other words, as the saying goes, when US catches colds, others get pneumonia. Now it has pneumonia. So what now? Thus the move towards so-called de-dollarization. 3, multilateral and international institutions should broaden their representation. There is a more vigorous call for greater and more substantive participation, including easing the unwritten rule that the World Bank president must always be American and the IMF's European, and expanding membership in both institutions as well as the UN Security Council. Furthermore, new development finance institutions have been established, like AIIB and the New Development Bank, led by the Global South, thus presenting a wider range of financing options. Climate change, while an agreed global priority issue, should be addressed by a combination of greater financing from the wealthier countries who contribute more to the carbon footprint and a more explicit recognition of the need for well thought out transition from fossil fuel, maybe perhaps to even include nuclear, thus avoiding the inclination of plunging headlong to renewables and then pressuring everybody else to follow suit. Number 5, one-size-fits-all definition of democracy and democratic political structures should give way to a greater recognition and tolerance of cultural and societal differences. And 6th, the voice of Africa, as articulated by Africans, must be duly recognized, and Africans' resource wealth should more decidedly be managed by and benefit Africans themselves. While there is no mention of leadership as such, Asia looms large, particularly if Asian core economic leadership is defined as including the present inclination of Russia to increasingly favor developing its Asian side and persona rather than its European one. This triumvirate of China, now first or second largest economy, India that has overtaken the UK to be the 5th largest economy, and an quote-unquote Asianized Russia represents a virtual juggernaut of commanding market size, population resource base, and rapid leaps in technological prowess, assuming the three hold together reasonably peacefully. Of course, the devil is always in the details, and ASEAN, being an emerging economy representative country, should adhere to the retaining harmony and peace with each other, not taking sides between global superpowers, broadening the range and resources of investment, carefully and rationally managing their transition from fossil fuel-based energy to more environmentally cleaner ones, continuing to increase and enhance the participation of the private sector and women in the economy, and finally, intensifying the use of technology for financial inclusion and diminishing of areas of discretion that lead to corruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. De Ocampo. A real manifesto, very interesting and very much in line with some of the thoughts that are driving action behind the BRICS and the competition at the global level for leadership. We'll come back to that. I'm sure that we have many ideas in the audience. Jean-Daniel, Gerber, you have been a senior policy maker. You will give us a European perspective on those very challenging issues.
Thank you. Is it working?
It is.
Okay, excellent. I will stay here if you permit. Thank you for giving me the floor to speak here, and I'm about to speak about Europe, not very much about short term, more about long term, what could happen till 2030. Let me say that in the short term, the economic situation in Europe is not the best one. As you know, the growth rate is only 0.4% and may increase next year to 1.4%. That's really not much. Now, if you look a little bit in the longer term, the growth rate is going to increase, but not very much. I will come back to that. Europe is facing some major issues, some issue I'd like to speak about it. Let me mention first climate change. All the countries in the world are suffering from that. Europe certainly also. Since 1950 to now, temperature has increased by 1%. It may increase till 2030 to 1.5%. That will be, if it goes over 1.5, it's a game changer. Flooding, sea level increasing, food crop, diminishing migration for climatic reasons, etc., etc. Let me give you a small example. I'm coming from Switzerland. In the last 2 years, the glacier have diminished more than in the last 10 years. Now you may say, glacier, who cares about glacier? Well, in Switzerland, it's tremendously important. The water dam, electricity, depends very much on glacier. And if the situation continues, in a few years, we may have practically no glacier anymore. This is a small example. I'm not going to dwell too much about climatic change because we will have a special lesson on that. Let me come to another issue. Demography. Europe has about 740 million inhabitants. In the next few years, till 2030, population is going to decrease by 3 million. In Russia, by 4 million. Aging. In Europe, 25% in 2030 of the population will be over 65. What does that mean? We'll have to increase productivity. However, productivity is not very big in Europe. So we will have to import labor, as we have done in the past. And we'll have, as a matter of fact, to increase the age of participating in the economy and retiring later. That will certainly happen. And at the same time, if you increase migration, like in all the other countries, that creates, of course, political difficulties with the local population. That's a challenge. The third challenge, energy. Here, Europe is doing fairly well. About 50% is already alternative energy in Europe. And look how globalization worked. Who would have imagined that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe would have changed so rapidly its energy resources, extremely rapidly. And that's due to globalization and the emerging markets, particularly North Africa and also Near East. That's very good. Here I open a bracket, globalization. It can also work the other way around. You know that sanctions have been taken against Russia. They don't know. They don't work very well. Why? Because of globalization. There are other sources of supply. I close the bracket. Third thing. Growth. Yes, the growth in Europe is low. Is that a big challenge? Yes, it is. However, it is less of a challenge than in other countries where the standard of living is low. Let me take China. We have heard about that. In China, the average income per capita is 10,000 US dollars and may increase to 15,000. In Europe, it's presently 36,000 and it will increase to 2030 about to 50,000. So what's more important for Europe, it's not so much the growth rate. And the economists should stop always to speak about growth rate for Europe or developed country. What is quite more important is the quality of life. And here Europe is doing very well. Look at the statistic. You know, you have good education, people are not starving, the environment is more or less okay. Migration takes place because the quality of life is so good. So let's speak about quality of life instead only about growth. That's not the case for the developing countries and emerging countries. There the growth rate is absolute necessity, in particular for the poor population. Let me come to the last point, the geopolitics. I will mention 2 points. There are many points. The first, it has been mentioned, the Ukraine-Russia war. It's a terrible thing. Nobody knows how it goes to end. Now, Russia is in a very difficult situation, Ukraine also. But look at Russia. GDP is decreasing, population is decreasing. Russia, globally, is not an economic power anymore, except for energy. It's not a geopolitical country anymore. They lost Eastern Europe, Central Asia. It's still a military power because of the nuclear weapon. And Russia is threatened with a nuclear power, as you know. You can imagine what would happen if that threat becomes a reality. And also the threat that Russia may invade the Baltic republics, or Poland. That would be terrible for Europe and for part of the world. And the third, as a second point I want to mention, EU. EU will increase by new members, Georgia, Albania, Moldavia, and maybe Ukraine. Now, that will, of course, lower the growth rate of Europe because these countries need a lot of subsidies. It's a big challenge. It will need also a redefining of the decision-making policy in the EU. That will be an institutional battle in the EU. Now, why is Europe doing that? Why? Facing an institutional battle, facing a low growth rate? The reason is the following. Because of the EU, we do not have war anymore among the EU members. And that is quite more important and compensates for a low growth rate. So I hope, as a matter of fact, that the enlargement of the European, despite all the difficulty, will take place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Governor Oliveira Campos Neto. The floor is yours.
No, it's on. Okay. Well, also want to start. Thank you for the invitation. And the idea is to talk a little bit about my side of the world, Latin America. So we have a diverse set of countries, but the sequence of shocks, and we make this comment at the central bank that we are not able to pass 6 months without a new crisis anymore. And so the sequence of shocks, I think, have synchronized some of the economies much more than they were in the past. You have much more synchronization in most of the countries, including emerging market with advanced economies. When you look at the pandemic in Latin America, they hit very hard. If you look at those graphs of the casualties by 100,000 people, you would see many Latin America countries. I think Peru is the first, and then you have Brazil, you have Argentina, you have many countries that are amongst the highest. Every country did a massive program to face the pandemic. And we're talking between 6% and 12% of GDP in different ways. You have direct transfers. In some cases, you have transfers that were aimed at promoting jobs. You have subsidized credit for SMEs, and so on. And so in the case of Chile, you allowed people to withdraw money from the pension funds. Except for Mexico, every country did a big package in terms of, together with a huge move in monetary policy. We are talking about the lowest rates that we've seen. In the case of Brazil, we had to lower rates to 2%, which was the lowest we've seen ever. And also the central banks injected a lot of liquidity. In the case of Brazil, 17% of GDP in liquidity and another 20% of GDP in capital. So the banks are very liquid, everything worked well. The reality, as we say, is that we got prepared for a depression, and at the end we had a recession, a mild recession in some places. And we faced some commodity shocks, but then the reality hits, which is we had a strong rebound in 2021, and the central banks were actually fast to see that the inflation was not as temporary as a lot of people were saying. I think because we come from a place where you have had high inflation for a long time, when we started to see the dislocation of demand for goods in most of the advanced economies, we started to say, okay, this is not going to be temporary. On the top of that, when you dislocate the demand for goods, you also dislocate the demand for energy, because to produce goods consumes much more energy. We started to see that would be more permanent. And a lot of the countries, engaged into early hiking. Brazil was one, but also Chile, some other places. But when we look at what we did, withdrawing the monetary stimulus was very coordinated. But that was not true when we talk about the fiscal policy. I used to remember when we had these debates at the BIS, what kind of fiscal policy should we adopt in times like this? People used to say you have to use the 3T, which is temporary, targeted, and temporary, targeted, and I wouldn't remember the last three, but we never passed the first T, which is temporary. Every program that we create in Latin America basically becomes permanent. And we look at the transfer of income that we have created, for example, in Brazil, it's now permanent. So we are faced with a lot higher debt. We look at the amount of debt that we have today, and it's also true of advanced economies. But when you look at emerging market countries, you started to see that this high amount of debt is charging its premium in the long end of some of the curves when you look at interest rates. And when we think about what could happen in terms of normalization, we look at the story that's being told, which is we are going to disinflation, and the disinflation process, and the disinflation had two stages. One was very easy to see because it was mainly energy and food, but now we have this process that's much more difficult. We have a resilient job market, we have growth that are at or above potential, we have unanchored inflation expectations in most places, we have a stubborn core inflation in most places, and in the case of Latin America, some of them are very, very difficult to go lower, even though Brazil is doing better in that sense. And we have an emergence of some indexation process. So on the top of that, we look at what is going to cause this disinflation, and we look around, and you don't see a lot of bright spots. We look at the movement of the geopolitics that was mentioned, the friendshoring and nearshoring. Except for Mexico and perhaps Vietnam, that proved to be much more expensive and also much more difficult. When you look at greenfield projects, you can map them. You're not going to see a lot in our part of the world. Also, the green transition showed to be much more complex and much more expensive. Some reports are saying this is going to add between 10 and 15% of GDP in debt for countries to be able to do that. So we have high levels of debt, still loose fiscal policies, high cost of green transition, high cost of restoring some of the supply chains, more uncertainty in the energy market, and perhaps when you look at what's happened in the last couple of weeks, you might wonder whether high for long is not talking about oil also. And that adds another layer. And when you look at the weather, which was mentioned here, the one thing is for certain, the price of food is going to be much more volatile. We just had rain in the southern part of Brazil and destroyed our production of rice just a couple of weeks ago. So that also means that we're going to have higher rate in advanced economies. So this is also withdrawing liquidity from some of these emerging market countries. And the fiscal premium could be affected at some point in time and could be increasing. On the top of that, I think it was mentioned here, that China is decelerating. You have all these structural questions on the demography and what's going to happen, and I'm not going to go too much into that. But the problem is, can the disinflation process stall at higher levels globally? And if that is true, what's going to happen? We're going to have to live with higher rates for longer. What's going to happen? What that's going to mean to emerging market countries? Because when you look at some of these reports, all of them point towards this disinflation process. But what is the disinflation going to come from now on? Oil is higher for long. The green transition costs money. The productivity is not going higher. If anything, it's going lower. So when we look around all these factors, the one thing that stands out is people think that we're going to have, for some reason, we're going to have labor's lack coming, and that will contribute to lower inflation. But that's far from guaranteed. And I think it has a big effect on my conclusion, which is we have liquidity drying up. some countries are actually, as of now, paying more for the debt, to roll over the debt by shortening the duration. If you look at the US, if you look at a graph that says what's the country that had the most deviation in terms of CDS in the last 3 months, in terms of worsening the CDS. Number one, well, now it's Israel. But if I had asked this question 3 days ago, it would be US. That is meaningful. That I think is very relevant from what we're talking in terms of the equilibrium for emerging market countries. So the liquidity might dry up. And I think there is a major risk that we are not following as close what's happening to the private debt. Because in the public debt, the government will short duration and eventually roll over the debt at a higher price. But the private debt, what is the meaning of having higher for longer in private debt in some of these countries? And that's what I have been looking at, and and for this presentation. And you look at SMEs, and you started to see that there are some cracks there. You look at credit card debt, for example. In the case of Brazil, the default rates on credit cards now 50%. And you see other countries are going much higher too. When you look at working capital levels, they're at the highest, in most of these countries, at the highest we've seen in many years. So I think at the end, the message is the governments need to start addressing the fiscal aspect. I think we are very, very coordinated on monetary policy. We are not very coordinated on the fiscal policy. I think this is starting to bite, even in advanced economies. And if we are not able to address that in a way that people will look forward in terms of the market prices and see that at least you have an equilibrium in the medium term, we might have a disruption in markets before we get to the disinflation process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor. Challenges everywhere. Madame Kaba, Madame la Ministre.
Mrs. Minister.
So you have headsets on your desk for those who need it. Madame la Ministre, pour vous aussi.
Your Minister, I'm planning on 8 minutes for you, and the mic is yours. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking the Emerging Markets Forums and the Political Center for the New South for giving us the opportunity to taking part to these high-level debates and to eventually tell you about the situation of Cote d'Ivoire. I would like to point out that the global context that was extremely well described by my predecessors here on stage has extremely strong impacts on the sub-region. And I'd like to tell you about sub-Saharan Africa and also give you a highlight on Cote d'Ivoire, the slowing down of the global economy, ongoing inflation, the tightening of financial conditions, the fragmentation of economies, and all other uncertainties that have been referred to have a strong impacts at different levels. And I'd like, if I may name but a few, first of all, the deceleration of global growth, which would go from 3.6 to 2.5% between 2022 and 2023. And I heard beforehand one of my predecessors say that these 2.5% are not acquired. So this slowing down involves weaker performances in terms of poverty reduction and job creations. Yet, according to the World Bank, Sub-Saharan Africa is dealing with 12 million young people trying to find a job, whereas our sub-region only generates, in the current situation, 3 million formal jobs on a yearly basis. The second point I'd like to refer to is that 55% of the countries of the region are at risk of extremely high over-indebtment. In 2023, when they were only 27% in 2015. And if the service of the debt only stands for 31% of the tax amounts and drastically reduces the margins of maneuver to invest into infrastructures, as well as in the achievement of the ODDs, Sustainable Development Goals, and countries that are already under high tax pressure and they're not keeping up with the efforts that they're asked to make of accrued internal restrictions. It is not an easy task for them, most of all because the level of digitalization of our economies is very low, and because the ponderation of the formal sector is very low in our economy. The informal sector is much higher. At the same time, we also register illicit financial flows, which lead them to lose $94 billion on a yearly basis in taxes, I guess. And we also have important players in our countries that are the large international firms that we are not able to fiscalize, and they are yet important players, and we are not efficient in taxation for these in order to collect some resources for our internal economies. The third point I'd like to highlight here is the agreements on the agricultural sectors due to the Russian-Ukrainian war and the COVID-19 crisis have put a strong stress on the risk and the importance of food sovereignty and security. It was already a present issue before these two first crises due to the underinvestments in our primary forms of agriculture, but also due to the security crisis that the region undergoes, as well as due to climate change effects on our agriculture. Today, United Nations considered that there are $600 million per annum, but the resources that we need to achieve these SDGs and manage transition, this climate transition, of course, and in the current context that is marked by harsh global financial conditions, the situation is a tremendous challenge for sub-Saharan economies. Our economies are forced to operate very hard arbitrations between the short-term adaptations to the macroeconomic shocks and respecting their commitments towards sustainable and inclusive development. What could I tell you about Côte d'Ivoire? Very quickly, I'd like to say that it underwent a very steady growth for a decade and also suffered from the COVID crisis and the like of all others, but it responded quite well because the growth rate was 2.7% after an average of 8% in 2021, and it quickly recovered from that downswing with a 7.2% in 2021 and 7.2% in 2022. Sorry, the lower percentage was in 2020. So appreciable results, and I like to blink at our donors because they helped us support our economies during this shock period, which was the COVID crisis. But of course, the shockwave did not stop there. They kept on having their butterfly impact, and money nowadays has become more expensive. Côte d'Ivoire still keeps very interesting economic perspectives with growth perspectives in the 3 to 4 upcoming years, which are around 7%, which is quite appreciable, yet the environment is uncertain. And as I said, money is expensive. Inflationist trends are going on and keep on going. And there's also an instability in terms of security in the sub-Saharan region. In these conditions, the margins of maneuvers of our states are limited, and such weakness needs very quick support measures on behalf of these states, or making sure that the undergoing measures be relaunched for the reduction of poverty and in order to relaunch our economies. So we need to accelerate the in-depth reform of our international financial structure, and this is to enlarge the access of developing countries in terms of big-sized fundings and infrastructural investments. The second expectation is the increase of SDT elements and the support of inclusive elements for the developing countries. The third point is a very important one, and it is to bring an answer to the issue of over-indebtednent in view of the international context. The SDRs, of course, should be reduced, and the development of the propitious system for the inclusion of the private sector, corporate growth, and a transformation that would support the needs of transformation of our own economies. And I shall stop there. I'll rest my case. Thank you. Thank you, dear Minister.
Mustapha, so you will complete this panel by giving us an overview on the region, perspective on North Africa, and potentially the Middle East, and maybe focus a little bit on the Maghreb region. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim, and thanks to the Emerging Markets Forum for inviting me, and with the Center for the Policy South, for the Policy Center for the New South. New South, yes. My colleagues have made great presentations, and I think it has been a long session for you. And I was asked to talk about the Middle East and North Africa region, and as Karim said. And I thought maybe I could say one word and stop. It could be, I could say, what a mess. Middle East and North Africa region is what a mess. And I could stop here. There is not much more to say, actually. Because it is really, it's a big mess. And so since Harinder will not be happy and Karim will not be happy that I will stop here, so I will say a few more things. Yeah. And since there are many people here that I know, and we have worked many years on this region, and since the 90s and the 2000s, we used to complain about the North Africa, the MENA region, and say, okay, it's too stable, it's slow reforming, they don't do much, there is not much growth, nothing is happening in this region. And we used to list all of the ills that this region was suffering from. We complain about the lack of reforms, about the governance. We complain about the gender gap, about low education performance, about the oil, the role of oil and in the region, and employment of the youth, and so on and so on. And we have our list, and we have written books, and we written, reports on this, in all kinds of ways. Now, fast forward 12 years since the famous Arab uprisings, 12, 13 years, and what do we have? We had an Arab uprisings which generated initially much hope and anticipation for a better future and for the region and democracy and so on, and turned out to be a nightmare. It turned out to be a nightmare with civil wars, political instability, and return to autocracy big time in many places. Now we see instability everywhere. We used to complain about stability, but we have instability everywhere now. And now we complain about instability because there are revolutions and counter-revolutions, unstable political regimes, civil wars and destruction, and maybe reconstruction, but very little reconstruction actually we're seeing. Then we had the pandemic. And then 2020, the pandemic hit, and the region was hardly hit like everybody else, and maybe more like Latin America, I think, close to Latin America. Average GDP growth rate declined by 5% in the region, including in the GCC countries. So it was a big shock. Some countries lost Tunisia lost 8.8% in 2020 of GDP, one of the biggest losses. Then, as the recovery started in 2021, what happens? Then we got the Russia-Ukraine war. And the big shock, which led actually in the region to a very strange phenomenon, which is a divergent impact. On the one hand, we have the GCC, the oil exporting countries, which did benefit a lot from that. Actually, the GCC countries got some of the highest rates of growth ever in their history into 2022. On the other hand, the oil importing countries all suffered, and suffered big time, because of the high energy prices, high food prices, and so on. So the burden of these shocks, you know, the Arab uprisings and all of the wars and the instability and the pandemic and the Ukraine wars, led us to 2023 with a situation which is, broadly speaking, worsening, deterioration in the situation, all over the place, in the whole region. Lower economic growth everywhere, higher inflation everywhere, higher debt ratios, some of them in situation of distress, debt distress situation. Many countries have debt ratios of 70, 80, 90%, more than 90% in some countries. And probably more poverty, more inequality, and higher unemployment, both for the standard people who suffer most, which are the youth and women in these situations. Now, and then we got the last shock. 2023 is not over yet, and then we have a new shock, the last Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which surged again on the picture. Now, this means that when you look at the medium to long term, the prospects look really grim. All of the traditional negative factors are still there. The ones we used to complain about, like 20 years ago, are still there. Nothing has been resolved. Whether it is governance, whether it is the dependence on oil, or whether it is the role of women in the labor markets, or whatever. But then we have all these new factors, which we didn't worry about at that time. The instability and security. I said we used to complain about stability. Now we complain about instability and security. The challenge of food security is becoming a big issue in the region. The climate change challenge, which is impacting the region probably more than any other region, like a few other regions in the world, let's say, at least probably as much as the Sahel region or some of the worst hit countries. And then the lack of adaptation to technological change, including digitalization. So while overall the impact of all of this is mixed on the oil countries, it's certainly for the oil importing countries, really the impact is lower potential growth as we go forward, as we look into the next 10 years. Certainly not we are going to talk about 4 or 5 or 6%. No way. We're going to talk about 2 to 2.5% on average, at best, if some of the risks that Indermit was talking about did not materialize, new ones. Persistently high unemployment. Unemployment rates in the MENA region are some of the highest in the world. In some countries, 15% or more, or 20%. Large debt burdens in a few countries, in many of them. Stalling of the poverty reduction process, which used to be one of the bright spots in the region. So all of this is really looks, as we look forward, looks really not very encouraging. Now, this is certainly a grim picture I'm presenting. And my mood is not very, very optimistic, let's say. The reasons for hope are very few as I look forward. And to conclude, I wanted to ask, just philosophically, to ask, okay, why? Why did this region stay in this big mess? It has been a big mess, stays in a big mess. And lots of ideas have been, advanced and told and retold again and again. Let me say what I think. My personal, like Indermit, Gill, this is my own cut on what's happening and what has been happening in the region. I think the region has been suffering all throughout the last 50 years or more, for 60 years, of two major predicaments. One is the oil wealth, and the second is Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have been reminded of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict now, and it's going to be continuing to wait on this region for a long, long time. And if it's not resolved, this region is not going to find stability, is not going to find steady growth, is not going to find better, living. So let me talk a few words about oil, the oil wealth. And there is a small twist to this story of the oil wealth impact. Actually, it turns out, as of today, as of now, that the impact has been divergent, actually, in this region. There is a small group of countries within GCC which have so much oil wealth for so little population that they have been able to overcome the negative impact of the oil wealth on the countries. They have been able to continue to finance the authoritarian bargain in the Middle East. They have been able to invest in the future, to invest in technology, to invest in everything they want to. Yes. But the rest, including the oil rich, the other rest oil rich, it has been a bad outcome for everyone. And whether it is the oil rich or the non-oil rich, the impact of the oil bin has been systematically negative. Whether through the indirect links, through the labor movements, through the, the investment movement, through trade or other. So the impact of oil has been devastating as far as I can tell on the region and continue to do so. And we are going to see this divergence continue in the future between the GCC on one hand and the rest on the other hand. And this is also a source of instability as we go forward, we look in the future. It's not sustainable to have so much wealth on one side and so much misery on the other hand. And I will stop here.
Let's open it to question, comments. Are you all tired? Masoud, there's mics on the tables, huh? Go ahead.
There's a mic, but I don't think it's working.
Attends-le في الطابلة. ها هو. Ouais.
Question for.
Il faut éteindre l'autre, je pense.
Question for Bobby.
Ou Maïma. Voilà.
The question really is that if you listen to Indermit, if you read the reports from the World Bank and the IMF, they present a very sober picture of prospects for developing countries, emerging markets for the next few years. And in fact, there are even more risks that Indermit highlighted. But when I listened to you, it was actually a very optimistic vision that you could actually have an emerging market conglomeration that's larger than the advanced economies in some ways, and if only they could get themselves organized, this could be the future. So I want to really ask you and maybe the other panelists to say, well, how realistic is that prospect, and what can be done to move from the vision and the prospects that the big Washington-based institutions are outlining to the one that you laid out? Thank you.
Very clear. Abdullah, please. On the table, the mic. You all have a mic on your table. Ça marche ou ça marche pas, Dreri? Là, ça marche ou ça marche pas? Sur la table, est-ce que ça marche? Voilà, donc arrêtez de... Ça marche, ça fait... On a confiance. Le New South est confiant en lui-même. Et voilà, confiance. Rapprochez-vous du micro. Il n'y a pas de problème, on est entre nous ici. Hania, yalla, tfaddal.
Mr. Moderator, I just want to say a few words about Africa to supplement what my dynamic minister and my friend, Minister Kaba, said. First, I really believe that you should look at Africa and try to make it an engine to deal with the problems, the economic problems that the world is facing today. I think there's a great opportunity in Africa for you to do that. And to do that, let's look at, and I'll be very brief, a few issues and few sectors and so on. First, Africa is getting together, is doing it better. We have a common market now. So really, you know, you could capitalize on that and improve trade with Africa. That's one. Two, I think you should look at the investment opportunities in Africa, particularly in infrastructure. UNCTAD says investment in Africa yields profits of 33%. And now, you know, we are not able to attract those investments. So look at the possibilities for investment. Look at the challenges of climate change. We are not creating climate change. We are not adding to it. If you help us adapt, it will mitigate your efforts for mitigation. And then I'll be at another 2 minutes. Let's look at the challenge of democracy and aging that my friend Jean Daniel raised. We have a population which is reaching 1.5 million. Much of them are young, educated. Find a solution of how best we can work together to be able to do that. And finally, look at the issues of illicit flows that Madam Minister raised. 80 billion years, 100 billion US dollars a year. Try to help us deal with that. We carried out a study when I was in ECA, and we know where the sources are and so on. So let us look at Africa in a positive manner, in a very positive manner. And I think if you do that, it will help.
Thank you very much.
One point, which I think is important. Many years ago, you robbed us to build your countries. Now we are saying, don't rob us. Come and let's work together and give you the opportunities that Africa is offering you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, it's a question to Mr. Campos. If I'm not mistaken, by the end of your talk, you mentioned that we are doing fine in terms of monetary coordination worldwide, but we should do more in terms of fiscal coordination. Could you elaborate a little bit more about that? What kind of fiscal coordination you mean? Is it about international fiscal coordination, countries not spending that much in relation to their neighbors? Or is it in terms of domestic gaming between the legislative and executive branches? What kind of fiscal coordination you mean?
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to comment on Mustapha's Nabli's gloomy picture that he gave to the Middle East and North Africa region. While I agree with him that there is a mess in some spots of the region, but I think the total picture from early in the century is much brighter, and there are a lot of achievements that should not be ignored.
Example?
Just to remind everyone that beginning on last centuries, from the 40s, 80% of the Arab population were rural. Only 20% are in the cities. Now it's the opposite. Based on World Bank numbers, the region was the highest spender on education during the last 40 years. And huge numbers of people have been brought out of illiteracy to literacy. I am definitely a product of that era. The second point I wanted to stress is that on the oil curse, this is absolutely, I totally disagree with Mustapha, because if it were not for the oil production, the GCC countries specifically, I would have been myself now going after my herd of probably camels or goats. The oil have been a big plus for the region. It definitely helped us get off total poverty that I personally remember when I was a small kid. But the other picture, it's not only for the region itself that benefited of the oil. In Saudi Arabia, there is 15 million expatriates, 60% of them from Arab countries. This is the same thing in Kuwait and Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia is the second largest remittances country after the US. It's larger than US in terms of the percentage. So tens of billions are annually sent to Egypt, to other countries in the region, which contributed a lot to the decrease in poverty and helping people live a better life. And it's not only in the Arab region, but also in some other Asian countries.
Your point is well made.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame?
You hear me? Oh, yes. So mine is a quick one. I work as a climate finance expert at Africa Development Bank, and mine would be maybe to the World Bank head, and maybe two questions quickly. One, with looking at the reforms and the evolution that World Bank is undergoing, what do you think is the place of private investment, especially the influx of it when it comes to climate action? Do you think we will see more of this with the evolution? Do you think we will see more of access of new IMF and new World Bank? And the second one is, climate change has become like a topic in itself in terms of it's a problem, and we see so many resources in terms of financial commentary. And so I don't know, my outcome and my hope out of this summit would be to see how do we open the channels of access, because that sounds to be the problem. And so looking at your projections, and maybe and to all the panelists there, when you look at the economic growth, how do you wish to trickle down access of climate finance? Thank you.
Thank you, Karim, and thank you all for your presentation. So I would like to mention 2 points, please. So I don't have this pessimistic vision, and I really don't want to have it. Why? Because we have one very great assets in developing countries, and more specifically in Africa. We have the young population. So the young population will make the difference. And specifically when you compare the situation in developing countries in Africa with the situation in many countries in the north, OECD countries or ASEAN countries. So we have this demographic dividend, and with specific policy, of course, we need to have some specific policy to raise and to get more growth. So this is my first point, is what about this demographic dividend in Africa? And the second point is about South-South integration. What about integration in South region, and about complementary policies, and specifically in the South, with the South? Thank you.
Thank you. So we will conclude. So I will 1 minute each, as we're running a little bit late. We start with you.
I'll depress them even more.
It's fine. We'll feed them, and they'll feel happy. So you take whatever question, but please 1 minute, so we're running a bit too late.
Yes. So as I was listening about Africa, I was thinking, so I was remembering what our forecasts were for the African countries, and you start sub-Saharan Africa won't do well unless its largest economies do well, right? So the largest economies are Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, Kenya, Sudan, and Ethiopia. If you look at the prospects for these countries, they are very poor. So as a result of that, it becomes very, very difficult for the region to do well when 80% of, when the 6 countries that account for 75% of its GDP are not doing well, right? Now, by that same token, you're right, these countries can turn things around because they actually have a lot of resources and so on. But I don't yet see any of the signs of those things in the sense of, you know, I guess a sense of urgency in these countries to actually address these issues. I don't see that, right? So I think that would be my main thing. Now, I think that the World Bank should be doing a lot more. So I think, for example, that we should be doing a lot more in terms of making sure that we provide a lot more financial assistance for the things that are the most needed in these countries. One of them is energy, one of them is education, then you've got health, you've got infrastructure, generally speaking. But I also think that we shouldn't be trying to sort of mix a lot of, climate change into this for Africa. I'm just talking about for Africa now, right? So, for example, why is it that we talk about green energy in South Africa to replace coal, right? When you can actually cut emissions by half by replacing coal with gas. Why is it that Mozambican gas is going to France rather than to South Africa? So I think some of these, so I would think that Africans should be asking these questions a lot more. And I don't see them asking these questions loudly, at least in the fora that I attend.
Thank you. Erik.
Does it work?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Fine, great. So I'm going to pick up the climate challenge because of course, it's very true that most of the developing world or the global south had nothing to do with creating the problem of climate change. And there's definitely the right, in my view, or the justness of having major transfers to compensate these countries for the damage. They are the ones most exposed to the effects of climate change. So all that is clear. What I think is needed is, this is really an opportunity, I think, for the Global South to make use of this willingness to be part of climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And for that, the Global South needs to implement policies that corresponds to that. And that's the way to attract very, I think, significant amounts of investment. So that, I think, is a huge opportunity for the Global South. The challenge I see is that so much of this now is happening in dollars, almost exclusively in dollars. And that is something that could create major instability in the short, or certainly in the medium term, but also in the short term. We need to find other ways of funding than dollars or foreign currencies. We need to find ways of working with local currencies, and there are several proposals now on the table, and we should look at them very carefully. I think they complement each other, and we need to make sure that these are adopted, particularly by us MDBs. I'm coming from a bank that finances infrastructure. Almost all the revenues are in local currencies. We cannot be part of creating this problem. We have to find ways of solving it, and I think that there is concrete proposals now on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Ocampo.
I was asked whether I was too optimistic, and whether I'm optimistic in the face of quote-unquote realities. Well, maybe I'm an unrepentant optimist, but there are certain realities, I think, that have to be recognized. The reality is that there is a shift from looking at a unipolar world to a multipolar world. I don't know how many of you don't think that's happening. There is a greater cry for more representation of the South, a bigger voice. There is a suspicion, to put it gently, that continued dependence for the entire financial system of the world on one currency may leave the South dependent on the whims of the North. All of these are, to me, realistic wake-up calls that are finally being listened to. And if I were correct that they are finally being listened to, then all those, World Bank and everybody else, the sober assessments, will finally look at it and really try to do something, because the alternative is trying to keep this from happening and going to war. Now, you know, for the sake of my children and grandchildren, I'd rather not see that happen. But now we're looking at a much bigger market. Remember I told you about the old model of Asian development, exporting to the West and using its low-cost labor? Now you're looking at a much bigger market that everybody, provided they're going to be sensible and friendly about it, can take to the entire world's advantage. That is the optimistic reality I'm hoping we're going for.
Thank you very much. Jean-Daniel, please.
Thank you. Thank you. So, it's working?
Yeah.
I'm also optimistic. Ladies and gentlemen, many of you...
Just getting closer. Yeah.
Many of you have participated in these meetings, which I like very much. Every year I hear the same song. The world is getting worse and worse. The problems are increasing, etc., etc. Sure, but at the same time, underline also the positive aspects in the last 20 years. Look at the health system, everywhere. Look at life expectation, everywhere. Look how women are treated now, quite better than they were 20 years ago. So look at the education. Look at alphabetization. This is a tremendous issue. And of course we have problems. But I venture to say that our problems are less than those of our fathers and grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers during the First and the Second World War. These were problems which we do not assess now. So in comparison, we are not doing that bad. Coming back to demographic, very rapidly. Europe has a demographic problem. Japan has a demographic problem. Have you ever asked why? Have you ever thought about that higher the quality of life is, the less women have children? It would be interesting ones to look at that. Yes, we'll have to compensate demographic through labor migration. And there we have a big challenge in the future, because our countries, every country in the world, don't like to have foreign migration. But we will have it if we want to maintain our quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Governor, please.
Okay, yeah, there was a question that was asked, and the topic of conversation was the state of global economy and its implication for emerging market countries. So I didn't focus on Brazil. My main point was try to raise the fact that there is one risk factor, and that is not being pessimistic or optimistic, it's just a fact that the debt post-COVID is very high. And then when we look at the cost of carrying this debt in most of the advanced economies, for example, in the US, you will go from 1% of GDP, maybe less. If you look at the futures of interest rates in the US and look whether the debt's projected to be, it's going to cost between 4.5% and 5.5% of GDP just to roll over the debt. And that eats up on the ability of the private sector to go into the market. So my point was just that we should start globally, and especially in the advanced economies, because I think Brazil on that front is actually doing better. Brazil has had good revisions positive in growth. We have a fiscal framework that was designed recently. But my point is that for us, it's important the cost of funding, after all. And what we are seeing right now is most likely what we'll see is high for longer. And the high for longer will mean that the cost of debt will be rolled at a higher and higher cost, because you not only have more debt, but you have more interest rates. And that will eat up on the private ability to roll over the debt. And that could be dysfunctional for emerging markets. That was my point.
Thank you. Very clear. Madame la Ministre.
No, I'd like to react and say that as a matter of fact, Africa, well, being optimistic vis-a-vis Africa, good. It's an Africa that is begging, of course, to participate much more and to take hold of its own destiny. It's possible with the youth. We do have an aging Western world. I think tomorrow's manpower is in Africa. The question of the democratic dividend is going to be put to the use of the world if our youngsters are well trained. Today, the weight of the youth does not allow our state to provide them with adequate, sufficient education. And I take joy in the fact that the economists of the World Bank say that more and more so, these are components and elements our partners should also integrate and mainstream interaction, so that this youth, instead of becoming a danger, becomes an active player in the world migratory flows, and it can be, of course, a positive element instead of a destabilizing one. This youth is going to be a good demographic dividend for Africa, but the whole world, which is now, of course, losing its manpower and labor, if only we are well supported in training these African youth. Merci beaucoup.
For you. The issue of linking to sub-Saharan Africa and what my friend Najat said about the demographic dividend. Don't forget, demographic dividend is a potential, is not an acquired dividend. You have to make it happen. And as MENA has shown, you can blow it. MENA blew the demographic dividend, we lost it. And we are soon on the path to demographic decline, so it's not acquired. You have to employ these young people, you have to give them good jobs, they have to acquire the skills, and all of this did not happen. And this links to my friend Abdurrahman about education and oil wealth and so on. I mentioned that the oil wealth was beneficial for the Gulf, there is no doubt about it. And I said this is because the Gulf countries have a very special situation, which is very high wealth, low population, so they have been able to spend a lot on education and improve quality of education, technology, acquire technology, do a lot of things that the rest were not able. For the rest, education, we educated, MENA is the example of huge investment in education. We invest everywhere, actually, oil and non-oil and Gulf and non-Gulf. But the returns on education has been the worst in the world. We educate people, and then what happened to them? Women, they stay out of the market, or they stay unemployed, and the men stay unemployed. Or if they are employed, they're employed in government with non-productive jobs. So there was no return on education. So people are educated, yes. And then, except for some of the Gulf countries, the quality of education is dismal. You look at the quality indicators, they are worst in the world. Quality. So we are spending education, bad quality, no returns. So for what? So that's why the dividend was really not acquired in MENA.
It can be a very long discussion. We can finish this at dinner. Well, once again, really a tremendous panel. We are lucky. Thank you for your candor, for really sharing with us your knowledge. Very complex, many entanglements, dynamics, politics, economics, so it's a very complex word that the best thing to try to understand it and shape good policies, it's to dialogue, it's to exchange, it's our collective minds together. Many thanks, alf marhaba, mille merci, so we'll see you at dinner. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. We have now concluded our sessions for the day. Please make sure to return your translation headsets at the registration desk before leaving the building. The Emerging Markets Forum and the Policy Center for the New South invite you to a cocktail reception at the foyer commencing at 7:05 p.m., promptly followed by a networking dinner in the restaurants area at 7:35 p.m. Colleagues from the Policy Center for the New South wearing white lanyards will direct you to the venue. Enjoy your evening and see you tomorrow at 8:30 a.m.